Hello everybody, this is the Wikstrand. So, which era in history has been the greatest when it comes to movies? Some would say it was the 80s, some say it was the 60s, some would say it is the 2000s, and some would say the 90s. My theory is that that was when you were growing up, you were in your late teens, early 20s, mid-20s, and you were going a lot to movies with your friends, and you hadn't really started a family yet. And you really had time to, watch a lot of movies and stuff like that. That is when you think, probably, that the best era for movies is. No one is technically wrong in this one. For me, it was the 2000s. Never in the history of time, since or before that, there has been as many 100-pointers, for instance. At no point in history, so many banging movies have been made in a variety of genres. Not just action film, not just science fiction movies, not just dramas, not just comedies. Every single solitary genre can be represented as in the absolute echelons of movie makings. The pantheon, if you want to. But there is a downside to that thing. Because the 2000s also saw some of the absolute worst movies in the history of cinema. And we're going to take a look at them today. Not just 2001, not just 2005, not just 2009, but we're going to take a look at the worst 10 movies from the entire 2000 decade. This is going to be rough. You want to know how rough it's going to be? Not Another Teen Movie, Blood Rain, In Hell, and New Moon. They're not even bad enough to be on the dishonorable mention list. This is going to be rough. Bear with us here because this is the top 10 worst movies made in the 2000s. Pray for us. I'm taking you with me to hell. The rules are essentially any genre, any country is fair game, but it has to be released between the year 2000 and 2009, not before, not after. So here we go with some dishonorable mentions. 40 Days and 40 Nights. You're going to hear this a lot throughout this list. This is a bad comedy with terrible jokes, and I wanted to hang myself rather quickly. And it is going to be difficult for me to tell you in so many different words why this comedy is terrible. 40 Days and 40 Nights is a romantic comedy that is gross to watch and made me feel very uncomfortable, and on top of everything else was really boring with unlikable characters, a setup that nobody believes, and has one of the grossest sequences I have ever seen. I very rarely feel uncomfortable about stuff that I see in movies, but this one made me irk a lot. Allt om min buske. Would you like to see a batshit insane sex comedy from Sweden? Sure I would. Wait a minute, what is that? This absolute train wreck about flowers and magic mushrooms and weird lesbians who do stuff. I have no idea how to describe it other than that it absolutely sucked, and it had absolutely no redeeming qualities about it. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't fun, and it sure as hell wasn't memorable. It is one of these super forgettable movies that the critics were sort of, what the fuck is this? Alvin and the Chipmunks. I don't know anything about Alvin and the Chipmunks. I just knew that I started having dreams about mousetraps and snapping the necks of these three wretched knuckleheads. They were so unlikable and they were so annoying that I wanted to kill all of them immediately. I'm sure this has nothing to do with the original blah blah blah, but I don't care. I just wish that the Chipmunks would die a horrible death. It is an incredibly unfunny movie with horrible singing, a wretched story. It was a movie that was so bad, even the Smurfs by comparison felt like a good movie, like a step up. And if that is the case, that is fucking saying something. Catwoman. You're trying to rob this place? Perfect. That is an actual line delivered by an Academy Award-winning actress. Jesus Christ. When you're talking about bad superhero movies, people usually talk about this as one of the worst of all times, and really it is. I actually like the way that Catwoman has been portrayed on the big screen over the last 30 years. Just not this one. This was a terribly directed, woefully written and horrendously acted movie with overacting all over the place, so many cliches that you don't know what to do with. The only thing that is worse than Halle Berry's terrible Catwoman is probably Sharon Stone's horrible villain. The special effects are terrible, and every time anybody opens their mouth to speak, I just want to vomit. And the sequence with the catnip, ooh, that one was rough. Dragon Ball Evolution. I don't know that much about Dragon Ball. I just know that this movie is probably not a good representation of the source material. It is a bad fantasy movie with a lot of overacting and bad special effects. And I just didn't care about anything, and the movie was a complete mess. The story was almost impossible to follow. The story was clunky, the actors were terrible, and the special effect was atrocious. The Druids. It is also known as Vercingetorix, and in Sweden, the Battle for Gaul. I have a rule of thumb. If you do a big historical spectacle, you must be very good at doing it, and you have to make sure that the money is shown on screen, that it doesn't look bad. It doesn't take a lot for a movie to look really bush league. Even a movie as big and as expensive as Alexander by Oliver Stone actually looked bush league in some cases, where it just looked cheap and bad. This is a sort of low-budget movie from France depicting Julius Caesar's invasion of Gaul, and it looks fucking awful. Add to that an awful performance by Christopher Lambert as the famed Gaul hero, and you have a recipe for absolute disaster. The movie looks cheap, makes no sense, and is shot in the worst way I have ever seen an historical epic being shot ever. Flight of Fury. There is an old Michael Dudikoff direct-to-video action movie called Black Thunder that came out about around 20 years ago, and somebody thought that it was a good idea to remake a bad action movie and replace Michael Dudikoff with Steven Seagal. And whoever came up with that idea should be punched, and then watch his family be punched, and then being punched by his family. This is an atrociously bad, cheap Steven Seagal movie that actually was even worse than even Black Thunder was. How the fuck do you do that? Jesus Christ! Göta kanal 2. Göta kanal was a reasonably funny Swedish comedy that was panned by the critics because it was silly and over the top and goofy nonsense. I thought it was a totally okay movie. The sequel, oh my god, it is impossible to look at. It's a sluggish, slow, cliched and awful movie with no laughter, with zero stakes, and all the attempts of modernization just screams, we are desperate, we don't know what we're doing. Wretched stuff. Inspector Gadget 2. Inspector Gadget was a terrible movie with a terrible Matthew Broderick attached to it. How about making a cheaper, even less funny version of Inspector Gadget? Inspector Gadget 2 basically took everything that was wrong with the first one and amplified it numerous times. The result is an ugly-looking, confusing and unfunny adventure comedy that made the first one almost palatable. I did say almost because it is still a fucking awful movie, and I will not forgive them for butchering my childhood. But this is an even worse butchering. They butchered the butchered thing. Ugh. The Nutty Professor 2, Clumps. I will say this, Eddie Murphy has a lot of talent. But when Eddie Murphy's creative visions get to run rampant, he always goes too far. He needs somebody to tell him, calm down, Eddie, we will do this, we will scale this down a little bit and we will make it funnier. You don't have to do all this bad toilet humor, you don't have to do this lowbrow humor, you don't have to play every member of your family. It is not funny. I did not like The Nutty Professor. That movie at least had a couple of funny sequences, mostly with Dave Chappelle. This movie has not a single joke that I thought landed correctly. They ran every joke into the ground. In the end, I cared even less for what's going to happen to Sherman than the first one. This is an absolutely atrocious, bad, awful and ugly comedy. But somehow this was not the worst comedy that Eddie Murphy put out this decade. I think you can guess what movie that is, but let's go to the actual list, shall we? Because number 10, Epic Movie. It sure takes talent to make a movie such a horrible experience that made me genuinely sad after watching it. I mean, I had been so disheartened by, you know, Not Another Teen Movie a couple of years later. And when I saw the trailer for Epic Movie, it looked just like the worst thing you could ever see. And yet, the trailer actually made this movie look almost palatable. But the thing is, these drawn out, boring, ugly, disgusting jokes that they are trying to do, cheap looking and horrendously unfunny. The thing is that when you see it in the actual factual movie, you just get so disheartened. Simply put, it is such a slow-moving, soul-killing experience. There is just so many ways that I can say this movie is not funny. There's just so many ways that I can say that the production absolutely sucks. There's just so many ways that I can say that there's nobody who is funny in this movie. But there is also something else. It destroys your soul while you're watching it. You feel like my heart is shrinking and my brain is shrinking. And the only thing that isn't shrinking is the cola lump inside of me that fears that nothing would be funny anymore. When I saw this movie, I just felt in my bones that they couldn't possibly make something that was worse than Epic Movie. But it would turn out that I was wrong, because there is a movie that's going to come up later on this list that is going to be even more disheartening to watch. It is so bad that this movie looks like The Naked Gun in comparison. And oh boy, when it comes to that, it is going to be epic. But not in this way, because this movie is just a cheap parody of various movies that have no connections to each other. The gross out humor is bad, the timing is all off. The only good thing I can say about this movie is it is not as bad as the other 9 movies on this list. Number 9, Alone in the Dark. Uwe Boll is basically the opposite of a stamp of quality on any movie, but this one is particularly disheartening. A confusing story about doors and, you know, bad CGI monsters attacking people, horrible action sequences, bad lighting, but it also has a couple of sequences that are so horrible that you think to yourself, didn't he notice that or didn't he care? I don't know which one of them is most disheartening, but I will go through it once again. I've actually done it once on another top 10 list I've done on the worst video game movies of all time. 1, there is a person that gets killed in some chambers and they leave her and then she moves. A corpse is moving. Great job, Mr. Cinematographer. But what is even funnier and even worse is actually a sequence that takes place a little bit, you know, earlier, where the sequence where Stephen Dorff is saved by Christian Slater when he shoots at a monster, but misses the monster and shoots, you know, 2 meters above him, and then he just falls down anyway. Maybe because of, you know, sheer embarrassment or something like that. It is a disheartening sequence to see, but it is also so funny that you cannot help by thinking, was it intentional? The rest of the movie is a boring snooze fest of bad action sequences, bad monsters, and all around horrendously awful acting, writing, and basically everything else that, you know, a movie is comprised by. If you ever have the chance to not see this movie, make it so. Number 8, Cat in the Hat. I will say that I'm not too familiar with Dr. Seuss and his writings, but every single movie I've seen based on his work has been the drizzling shits. The Grinch was bad, The Lorax was bad, but they are like the Godfather in comparison to the Cat in the Hat. How do I describe this one? The only good thing about this movie is some of the sets have a, you know, strangely outwardly appeal to it, but that's about it. The story about these 2 hell-raising kids that get to learn some valuable lessons from the Cat in the Hat is something to behold. Mike Myers looks absolutely terrifying as, you know, this abomination that looks like, I don't even know what he looks like. He looks horrible. It doesn't stop there, however. It doesn't stop with Mike Myers' horrendous overacting. It doesn't stop with his terrible writing, the awful pop culture references, and the, you know, attempt at adult humor, which just makes this movie even more childish than it already is. It is just how unpleasant it is. It is how ugly looking it is, how bad CGI is. This is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. The movie is so drawn out and the movie is so sluggish and all the characters are so unlikable that I just wanted to end, but it just wouldn't. And when they acknowledge that they're doing, bad product placement, stuff like that, it doesn't work. Acknowledging that you're doing a bad thing is not the same thing as fixing that you're doing a bad thing. Jesus Christ! The Cat in the Hat is an absolute freak of nature, and the only good thing about it was the joy I felt inside when the movie was finally, mercifully over. Number 7, Giggly. When this movie came out, it was met with an absolute barrage of bad reviews. The reviews were so bad and the movie was so despised by everybody that, there was radio stations here and there in the United States that, had contests where you would, go watch the movie and you would get prizes like a t-shirt that said, "I survived Geely," or something like that. But is the movie actually that bad? Yes. Yes, yes, it is. It is a movie that works on absolutely zero levels. It is boring, it is pretentious, it is shallow, it is confusing, and it has a very simple story that it confuses with a lot of weird, sequences that doesn't belong there. You have Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck in their most obnoxious personas, and you have absolutely no idea where things are going. But in this case, this is a bad thing, because you have no idea what they're trying to achieve with it. And they have sequences where, how did that happen? And the movie just kind of ends. I guess they got bored of how bad this movie was. They said, let's just wrap this thing up and go home and do some coke. This is one of these movies. It's really bad. It's very, very bad. But I have problems explaining how bad it is and why it is bad, because the movie is so confusing. The characters' motivations are so confusing, and you have no idea why any of this is happening. And then the movie just ends in a very anticlimactic and incredibly flat way. And then you're just left with, what the fuck was the point of this? What was the point of any of this? Jesus Christ! I've never been a huge fan of Jennifer Lopez as an actress. I am a semi-fan of Ben Affleck. When he's a director, he can be really good, but as an actor, he can be very wooden and very boring. They tried something else with this one, but it just made him an obnoxious tool which I wanted to strangle. Anything positive with it? Not even Al Pacino can, lit up this joint, and if he can't do it, who the fuck can do it? Geely is an absolutely train wreck, and it is not even fun to watch. You just want it to end. I'm gonna say that a lot in this list, I think. Oh God, it's bad. Number 6, Blair Witch 2, Book of Shadows. I really liked the Blair Witch Project when it came out. I thought it was really innovative, I thought it was very, very suspenseful, and despite it being a little slow and a little boring, I thought still that the end of the movie was excellent. And I was really looking forward to a new movie, and I was actually in favor of them doing it as a normal movie and not as a found footage movie, because it tied into the whole thing. But that is when the, positives ends. I reviewed this movie a couple of years ago in Seattle of all places, and I'm going to emphasize what I said then. It is one of the least scary movies I've ever seen in my entire life, filled with the most unlikable, douchey assholes I've ever seen. Few times in the history of cinema I have more wanted people to die than in that movie. Then it ended with what I can only consider as one of the dumbest, most head-scratching endings I've ever seen in a horror movie. It is the worst ending to a horror movie I've ever seen. It is not the worst horror movie I've ever seen in my entire life. I don't think so, but it is surely, one of the top 5 worst horror movies I've ever seen. If you've ever been morbidly curious to see what the sequel to the Blair Witch Project looked like, I would actually advise you to see it, because it is so bad that you're kind of laughing at how bad it is. And it doesn't stop there. The hokey acting, the horrible editing, and the laughable setups that they're doing is actually kind of endearing and actually almost sweet in some occasions. But this is one of these movies, when I saw it, 22 years ago for the first time, I was like, what the fuck is this? And It hasn't gotten any better. It killed the planned trilogy of Blair Witch movies. I don't know if we're supposed to be happy about that or if we're supposed to be sad about that. One thing is for sure though, a sequel to this movie could not possibly have been any worse than this movie, because Jesus Christ, this movie fucking sucks. Number 5, Against the Dark. Now picture this, if this movie would have been made in like 1992, I think it could have been a hokey, guilty pleasure action schlockfest that we could have, you know, loved and adored. The story is basically, there has been a vampire apocalypse and the world is almost taken over by vampires. And the war against the vampires is fought with Steven Seagal slicing them up with a samurai sword. That sounds fun. Unfortunately, this movie was not made in 1992, but in 2009. Which, of course, means that we have sad, fat Seagal that is walking around in this abandoned building and occasionally, you know, encounters a vampire or two. But Steven Seagal is actually the best actor in this entire movie. Just think about that for a second. In this movie, Steven Seagal is the best actor. The rest of them are film school rejects who couldn't act themselves out of a bag in an action movie that has almost zero action, and when it shows up it is sloppily, it's ill choreographed, and it is boring. If you've ever wanted to see how a really bad Steven Seagal movie is, this is the poster child for it, because I don't think he has ever done anything worse than this. It is one of the worst action movies I've ever seen. It is definitely the worst vampire movie I've ever seen in any sort of word. It's even worse than all the Twilight movies, and that is fucking saying something. And if at least Steven Seagal would have been present through the entire movie, and if he would have been, you know, our main character that we see all the time and doing stuff, at least he have some name values who at one point actually meant something. But we're spending so much time with all of these, you know, cronies that he has that's walking around in this building doing stuff. And a war against vampires where everything takes place in an abandoned building and we only get snippets of, you know, the war that has been fought outside. Good call, everybody. Gold stars. When you're begging that sad, fat, old Steven Seagal shall return to the screen because you can't stand whatever is in front of you at the moment, your movie has a lot of problems. Worst action film of the 2000s? You bet your ass it is. Number 4, Son of the Mask. I did a survey recently when I asked what is the worst sequel of all time, and people, you know, suggesting various movies. I can't remember what they all were. You know, they were the classical Basic Instinct 2, I think, was in the mix. But then somebody said Son of the Mask. Then I said, that's it. That's it. That is the worst sequel of all time. I love The Mask. I think it is one of the funniest, most creative comedies that has been made ever. It's a very simple story, and it's told wonderfully by Jim Carrey, putting on one of my favorite performances of his ever, and Cameron Diaz in her fantastic debut. And the special effects actually still holds up because they look cartoonish in the best way possible. Years went by, almost a decade went by, and Jim Carrey kind of shifted his career a little bit, and the ever delayed The Mask 2 never came out. And finally, 2005 saw the release of Son of the Mask, where they had replaced Jim Carrey for Jamie Kennedy. Jamie Kennedy. It is like replacing the Led Zeppelin with Uncle Kracker. I'm sure nobody's going to complain about it, and I'm sure it's going to be quite as good as the last time. Yes? No! Jamie Kennedy is so unfunny, and all of these jokes that they're doing here are so unfunny that I don't think that even, you know, on his best day on cocaine, I don't think that Jim Carrey could have, you know, pulled this one off. The story about just another man-child that doesn't want to take responsibility and has an incredibly hot chick for some reason, is going to be a father, and then the mask shows up, and, you know, low-key the God of Mischief played by Alan Cummings come after him, and everything is just so fucking weird in this movie. All the wide-angle lenses, the incredibly annoying music number that just goes on and on and on and on and on and won't fucking end. Bob Hoskins yelling, "Low-key!" and all these horrible sequences in a family pictures, you know, when, you know, the babies with their you know, vampire teeth, and, you know, the dog that's getting his eyes pulled out and all that stuff. It feels like they wanted to do some kind of grotesque horror movie, but instead did some kind of a weird, weak family comedy. And the jokes are so bad, and the toilet humor is so horrible, and the acting is so obnoxious. Despite this movie being released more than 10 years after its predecessor, it somehow looks so much worse. I genuinely felt sad when I saw this movie. All the horribly written characters, all the bad jokes, all the wacky, frightening sequences that looked somehow at the same time lame and mega frightening, more frightening than some horror movies. As a comedy, it's a nightmare. But when it comes to, you know, how bad a sequel can get and how it actually can tarnish the legacy of another movie, this will definitely take the cake. I'm actually very glad that Jim Carrey never done this. I'm just glad that Stanley Ipkiss is banging Cameron Diaz in Edge City right now and is not, you know, involved whatsoever in this movie. Fuck me, this movie sucks. Number 3, Norbit. Rumor has it that Eddie Murphy was going to get an Academy Award for his work in Dreamgirls, but this movie came out and put an end to the whole thing. I don't know if that is true or not, but considering how bad it is, maybe that is the case. Now, do I like Eddie Murphy as a comedian? Yes. Do I think that his 80s movies are great? Yes. Do I think that a couple of his 90s movies are okay? Yes, some of them are. But he just became so obsessed with making bad movies where he played lots of characters and, you know, playing against himself essentially. And while The Nutty Professor 2 Clumps was a terrible and awful and horrible experience, you ain't seen nothing yet. Norbit is one of the worst comedies I've ever seen, even though we do have one or maybe two more at the top that will actually outclasses this one in bad comedy, but this one is so gross. I have nothing against making fun at, you know, different types of people. I have no problems with any form of, you know, I think comedy should be that if you can't joke about something, you can't talk serious about something. I have absolutely no problems. They can make jokes of anything they want to. That is the point of being a comedian. But I've never been a huge fan of fat jokes. If you're going to do fat jokes, do good ones. This one did not. And my least favorite form of comedy made in the worst way I've ever seen. Ooh, it is bad. This movie has basically one joke. Eddie Murphy is playing a woman and she is fat. That's the joke, and it is not funny. And then he did it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And you know what? It wasn't funny then either. I didn't laugh a single time during this movie. Not a single joke worked. And it was just so long, and it was just keep going and going and going. And I didn't care whether or not Norbit would get away from this behemoth of a woman and, you know, finding luck somewhere else or finding happiness somewhere else. I wanted all of them just to die. Him and all the other people he played in this movie, which was, when I think about it, it was quite a lot of people I would have want to die a horrible death in front of their families. Norbit may be the worst movie Eddie Murphy has ever done, but it is clearly not the worst comedy of all time. Number 2, disaster movie. As you remember, epic movie. Number 10, very, very bad movie. Horrible movie. You know, kicked basically parody to death. Now, somebody saw that corpse of that parody and just continued to stomp it to death and then set fire to it. Disaster movie is everything epic movie was, but worse. It had, you know, as much gross out humor, but worse. It had as many bad physical comedy angles and, you know, gags, but worse. You know, Iron Man gets a cow dropped on him. Hannah Montana gets a big boulder dropped on her. I don't care. This movie has frequently been called the worst comedy of all time. I sort of agree with that, because it is so incredibly boring. It's so lazy. It is so lame. There is no structure in this movie, and none of the jokes works. I've been saying that a lot, but turns out that, you know, bad comedies is something that is difficult to critique, because there's just so many times that you can say that, you know, that joke wasn't funny and this joke wasn't funny, and none of this makes any sense. Why I think this movie is not quite as bad as our number one, which is also a comedy, by the way, is the fact that at least this movie has the courtesy of at least switching to something completely different. It's going to be bad, it's going to be awful, it's going to be horrible, it's going to look cheap, and then going to be continued kicked to death. But it is still not as bad as our number one. I'll get to that in a second. I just want to say that Disaster movie is such a complete disaster. It is almost, you almost have to applaud them, because I don't think I could make a worse parody if I tried. Even on purpose, it takes skill and talent to make something this bad. But there is one movie that is worse, one comedy that bottoms them all, or tops them all, or however you want to phrase it. A Fateful Night. I watched on TV. Number one, Master of Disguise. So you remember Wayne's World, right? People said it is one of the funniest movies of all time. I saw it in the perfect age for me to enjoy Wayne's World. I think I was 12 or 11 or something like that. It should have been, I wish I should have been howling with laughter, but I was like, funny. There was a couple of sequences that was endearing and kind of fun, but I thought it was very obnoxious, and I didn't like Wayne or Garth at all. I particularly didn't like Garth. I thought he was really lame, and I thought he was incredibly unlikable, and I wanted him to die a horrible death, like being eaten by ants or something like that. Dana Carvey kind of fell off the map after Wayne's World. But he apparently, you know, was one of the people who performed on Saturday Night Live. And one of his things was actually he did this Master of Disguise thing, where a celebrity would come in, go behind the screen, and then Dana Carvey was coming out, apparently, you know, disguised as said celebrity. Shaquille O'Neal, for instance, or Britney Spears, or something like that. The joke is that you cannot disguise yourself into Shaquille O'Neal if you don't at least have the same height as Shaquille O'Neal. And you cannot disguise yourself into Britney Spears if you don't, you know, look a little bit like Britney Spears. So they decided to take this bad joke and turn it into a feature-length film. It resulted in the second worst comedy of all time. There is one movie that is even worse than this, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's a secret. The key reason why this movie doesn't work is spelled Dana Carvey, because he was like Adam Sandler in this movie, only even more annoying and even more childlike. In fact, the more I think about it, this movie feels like an Adam Sandler movie, just not played by Adam Sandler, but with Dana Carvey, who is actually less funny than Adam Sandler, because Adam Sandler has done a couple of movies that I think is kind of funny. And he is a pretty good actor, actually, when he does, you know, dramatic roles. But Dana Carvey has never done anything that I have thought is funny or good. And we're gonna have to listen to his childish voice for this entire time. Only when he tries to, you know, become an Indian snake charmer, or when he comes to become what I think is Scarface, or when it becomes a British man with a cane, or all the other stupid shit nonsense. I just wanted to shrink through the earth. When we dress up like a fucking turtle in the Turtle Club, not a turtle, not a turtle, shut the fuck up, I want to strangle you, you fucking asshole. And the movie just went on and on and on. At the same time as Brent Spiner, who, you know, is probably most famous as Data, he wants to, you know, steal a bunch of, you know, landmark things like the Liberty Bell or stuff like that, with the help of, you know, all the guest stars that showed up for this movie, like Jesse Ventura or somebody else, I can't remember what it is. And then he laughs and he farts a lot. Horrible action sequences where they actually have action sequences that kind of shows up out of nowhere. All the jokes land flatter than a plate full of piss at 4 o'clock. This movie just went on and on and on. And the thing is, it's a very short movie. And when they keep doing cutouts and extra sequences during the end of the movie, during the end credits, I just thought, I'm not free. It's still going. The reason why this movie is so horrible, and it's even worse than Disaster Movie, is the fact that we are stuck in the same bad sketch for over 1 hour, and it seems like it is never ending. The movie just refuses to end, and I hate everybody involved, and I hate the stupid ass special effects. I hate the stupid ass jokes that never lands, and this movie just keeps going and going and going and going. I just wanted the whole thing to just explode, and oh god, this movie made me actively angry. I was angry for 2 weeks after seeing this movie. Master of Disguise may look like an innocent, run-of-the-mill comedy, but when you dig deeper into it, you just realize that nothing matters. All the jokes that are made are just making me angry, and I think at some point when it was 15-20 minutes left of it, I just said, I might not survive this. I might have to turn this off. I have never turned off a movie because it was so bad, but this movie is so bad. When it showed it on an airplane, people still walked out. So I'll see you next time for, well, so-and-so reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.